The Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away, so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And Jesus said, "Bring them here to me." Then Jesus ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, Jesus looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
You may be seated. Why did the 5 loaves and 2 fish go to a party together? Because they wanted to multiply the fun. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I recently met a pastor who was also a stand-up comedian. And it just occurred to me that his people must have so much fun listening to him for 15 minutes on a Sunday morning. But don't worry, I won't try that too often. Well, Dina, Pastor Andrew, and I did not plan the date for the church picnic based on the scriptures for today. But it is a bit serendipitous. I felt a small dose of delight when I realized that this Sunday we were reading the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. I've always loved this story. It's, this tale of Jesus throwing a giant party for more than 5,000, because we had the men were 5,000 plus all the other people. More than 5,000 people who had gathered with him. This is one of the first biblical stories I remember learning in Sunday school. Right? I remember listening to my mom talking about how the story is about how much God cares about feeding God's people. And as she told this story, I was, scribbling some brown in 5 loaves on my coloring sheet, and then taking a purple and a pink pencil and individually coloring all the scales on the fish. It's a good memory for me. And I imagine that this is a familiar story for all of you as well, because I'm sure it was a main topic in Sunday school growing up. But if not, consider this an invitation to spend some time with this most famous of Jesus' miracles. Not every story that we read in the Bible, in the Gospels, are in each of the 4 Gospels. We have 4, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, for example, only Luke tells us the story of Jesus healing the 10 lepers. That's only in one gospel. Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us the story about how Jesus calms the storm. Remember that one? Jesus and the disciples are out on the lake, and there's a big storm, and the disciples are all panicking, and Jesus is sleeping. Right? But then he calms the storm and all is well. So 3 gospel writers tell us that story. But only one story of Jesus performing a miracle is in all 4 gospels. And it's this story that we read today, Jesus' multiplication of 5 loaves and 2 fish. Right? So it's a good story to become familiar with. But here's my question. What do you think this story, highlighted by all 4 gospel writers, is about? What lesson are we meant to take from it? I'll just give you a second to think about that. So there's a variety of ways that people have answered this question, what is this story about, through the years. Some commentaries and commentators focus on the miraculous aspect of this story, right? Jesus is God. This is a sign of his divine power, and so he's able to take this small amount of food and make it enough for everybody. Other people have focused on the idea of generosity and sharing. So in John's version of this story, a small boy is the one who offers his 5 loaves and 2 fish to the disciples to help feed the masses. So some people think this is about generosity and sharing. And yet another interpretive angle, the story of Jesus taking these simple elements, bread and fish, and turning them into sustenance for a mass of his followers, is often seen as a foreshadowing of the Last Supper, and therefore a foreshadowing of communion, right? Jesus feeding Jesus' people. I think all of these interpretations have some merit. But when I was reading this passage again last week, it struck me that in some ways, this is a passage about discipleship. So let's go back and read it again. Maybe take out your bulletins if you're a visual learner so you can follow along with me. So the story starts with Jesus getting some really bad news. And that bad news is that his beloved cousin, John the Baptist, has been killed. And so Jesus wants to go away to a quiet place by himself. He wants to find some space to grieve. But then the crowds come to him, right? And these crowds, all these people have a lot of needs. They need teaching, inspiration, but particularly they have heard that Jesus has power and they want him to cure their sick. And so the story tells us that Jesus had compassion on them. And instead of going away and finding his space to grieve, he takes time to be with the people healing their sick. So this is a whole day-long event, and by the evening, people were hungry, right? So they had been, we heard that Jesus comes in off the water, and they're in a deserted place, some kind of field next to the beach, and they didn't have access, the people, to food and other provisions. And so the disciples, who are, Jesus' right-hand people, they're the ones playing crowd control. Okay, just wait your turn to see Jesus, right? They had gotten really worried. They had noticed that people were in need. They were concerned. And it's the exchange between Jesus and the disciples here that I want you to really look at with me. So the disciples come to Jesus. They're a bit anxious. They say, "This is a deserted place. The hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." I feel like I've had this exact same conversation when planning ministry events before. Hey, let's not have this meeting go too long, otherwise people will get hungry. Or this event is going to go sideways if people aren't able to get home for dinner. In a way, the disciples were just being practical, right? You can almost imagine them huddling together and talking over the situation. These people are hungry. What are we going to do? I think they need to figure out their own meals. I mean, Jesus has done what he set out to do. He's been healing people all day. What more do they want? They'll be able to find food in town, right? Reasonable, right? But notice Jesus' response. He gave the disciples what I always think of as a piercing stare and said, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat. You give them something to eat." We spend so much time marveling at this miracle of Jesus multiplying loaves and fish that we often miss this charge Jesus made to his disciples. You give them something to eat. You. In other words, hey guys, this is in fact our problem. We're all in this together, so let's figure it out. I think the instinct of being willing to help, but only so far, is one that many of us have. We want to carefully define our zones of responsibility. We draw boundaries around how much of ourselves we're willing to give. And lest you go away from this sermon thinking that your pastor is telling you to just give and give and give, that's not good for anybody. I want to say it's a good thing. Boundaries are a good thing. Being a disciple of Jesus does not entail giving or working yourself into destitution or emotional exhaustion. And yet, even as we draw boundaries, it's important to acknowledge that we have a collective responsibility to care about and for the fate of our fellow humans. Compassion is the keen awareness of the interdependence of all things, theologian Thomas Burton says. Another way to say this is that just because it's more practical to send people to get their needs met elsewhere, doesn't mean that's what God is calling us to do as members of God's community of love on earth. As disciples of Jesus, one of our tasks is to discern in various situations how much we are able to give and what our role might be in responding to the needs of others. Throughout his ministry here on earth, Jesus modeled this kind of openness to the call of God to extend care. Jesus saw the widow of Nain on the outskirts of town, right? He wasn't with her, he just sees her. He has compassion for her because she's grieving the death of her son, and he goes and he heals her son. He goes to her. Jesus was open in discernment when he saw Zacchaeus up in a tree. He realized that Zacchaeus needed care. Zacchaeus needed to be brought into the community. And so Jesus extended care to him. There are so many examples of Jesus not just caring for others who were right in front of him, but extending his care to those outside of his normal social circles. I think about our reluctance to bear responsibility for the needs of others too far outside of our, social circles when I consider the difficulty that Eugene, Portland, and other West Coast cities are having with unhoused people, right? When we look at the mess that often comes with homeless encampments, the associated costs and garbage and complicated situations, I get why people feel anxious. Why they want to pull down the tent cities, round up the people living on the streets, and bus them anywhere else. On the days, and particularly in the winter, when I come into the church office and, there's people sleeping under the covering outside of the fellowship hall, and there's like stuff everywhere, stuff I consider junk. It looks terrible. I am quick in those moments to want to outsource responsibility for that, right? We are already housing people on our property. We can't take care of all of these people. It's someone else's job to take care of them. Some of that is sort of true, right? But not completely. Perhaps cahoots, first responders, are the people who actually will most likely be able to provide in the best way possible for the people sleeping out there. In some ways, it is true. We are not up for sheltering every one of these folks. But we're certainly able, I am certainly able, to provide a positive human interaction and a cup of coffee until the cahoots first responders arrive. And cahoots and the police and St. Vinny's and the city, right? All the other organizations that serve the unhoused population around here cannot do their work without the support of people like us, right? Our role may not be to actually house people, but we have a role in providing resources, support, and advocacy to say it is our concern. All of these people are our concern as a city, as a community, right? We share collective responsibility for the well-being of our community and all the individuals in it, all of them, even those who seemingly have endless need, even those who it would be more practical to send away. When we think about what it means to follow Jesus, to be Jesus' disciples, a big part of that is to accept that Jesus turns our attention to people outside of our main social circles, outside of our closest family and friends, outside of the folks that we deem worthy of our care. And Jesus asks us not to just send them away to fend for themselves, but to have compassion for them. Maybe take a moment to think about the individuals or groups that you tend to feel anxious about and hope they get their needs met elsewhere. I think whoever comes to your mind, it might be helpful to remember that ultimately most of our anxiety about these groups of people or these individuals is born not actually of indifference. I don't actually think that's what's going on in our hearts, but it is born out of anxiety, right? That we are not able to provide for all that they need. And they're just like the sheer amount of need can feel overwhelming. And so there's no shame in this feeling of wanting to pass on responsibility. But noticing where it comes up for us and facing it head on can help us become aware of where our compassion might be able to grow. Ultimately, Jesus' charge, you give them something to eat. You give them something to eat, is an invitation. It's an invitation to participate in Jesus' profound compassion and care for all God's people. Nelson Mandela once said, "Our compassion binds us one to the other." Not in pity or patronizingly, but as human beings who have learned how to turn our common suffering into hope for the future. To move past our scarcity mentality, to have compassion for others, to say your well-being and mine are intertwined, is an act of hope. Hope that, as the crowds did that day, we can all come to Jesus for healing, for inspiration, for sustenance, and that through the love of God, the 5 loaves and 2 fish will multiply, and that we will all have enough. So I don't know, maybe this passage isn't about discipleship after all, but about compassion, about asking God to help us expand our hearts and draw us into God's always growing circle of care. Friends, today is church picnic day, and we are celebrating Jesus throwing a giant dinner party. But we're also celebrating and acknowledging that Jesus asks us to help him put the party on. We're all in this together, in a giant web of compassion. Let's go forth in hope, have a party, and give God's people something to eat. Amen.